There's a moment, and I've seen it maybe 3 times in 40 years of living rough on the frontier, where the entire room goes quiet not because something ended, but because something began that nobody in that room had the language to explain. I was in Dunmore's saloon on a Tuesday in late October when it happened. I had a lukewarm coffee in my hand, a ledger open on the table in front of me, and absolutely no intention of becoming the man who'd remember this day for the rest of his life. She walked in carrying firewood. That's it, that's all she did. And 37 men, gamblers, ranchers, drifters, a preacher who should have known better, turned and made her feel like she'd walked into a place she had no right to breathe in. Then Cole Whitmore stood up, and everything I thought I understood about this territory, about what a man's money could and couldn't buy, about what a woman was or wasn't worth in 1887, all of it cracked open like dry ground after the first hard rain. I'm going to tell you what happened, not the version people cleaned up later, not the one the newspaper printed, the real one, the one I wrote down in my ledger that night because I was afraid I'd convince myself I'd imagined it. I didn't imagine it. My name is Elias Cord, and I keep records the way some men keep religion, obsessively, and usually because I'm afraid of what I'll lose if I stop. I've been a land surveyor for the Santa Fe Railroad's Western Expansion Division for 11 years. I carry 3 notebooks at any given time, one for measurements, one for correspondence, and one, the small leather one with the bent cover that my wife called my worry book before she passed. That's the one where I write the things I can't send to anyone. I was in Dunmore, New Mexico territory on a surveying stop. The town was a middling kind of place, ambitious enough to have a proper saloon and a 2-room schoolhouse, but honest enough to still have mud streets and a sheriff who doubled as the barber. I'd been there 4 days, and already I'd mapped more of the surrounding terrain than the railroad engineers had managed in a month. I was good at my work, precise. I liked things I could measure. What happened in that saloon was not something I could measure. I'd been sitting at the far corner table, my preferred position, back to the wall, clear sightlines to the door, since about 2 in the afternoon. The saloon wasn't packed, but it had its regulars. Old Dunn himself behind the bar, broad and slow-moving the way men get when they've been standing in the same spot for 20 years. A card game in the center. A few ranch hands leaning into their drinks like the drinks owed them something. And over by the side door, near the woodpile, the argument. I'd heard it start without really listening to it, the way you hear a creek running without thinking about where it goes. A woman's voice low and steady. A man's voice irritated. Then a second man's voice joining in, pitched higher, mean-spirited in that easy way that costs people nothing until suddenly it costs them everything. I looked up. She was standing with an armload of split wood against her chest, 3 logs balanced with a precision that told me she'd done this 1,000 times. She was Apache, I could see that immediately, and I want to be careful here because I'm a man who deals in facts, and the fact was that in Dunmore in 1887, being Apache was not a neutral detail. It was a sentence. It was the first thing people saw and the last thing they ever looked past. Her name, I'd learn later, was Sonali. She was maybe 25, though she carried herself with the kind of stillness that makes age meaningless, the stillness of someone who has decided, at some foundational level, that the world's noise is not her emergency. She wore a cotton work dress, dark blue, with her black hair tied back simply. She had a burn scar along her left forearm, old, healed clean, the kind that comes from fire rather than accident. Her eyes were dark and steady, and they were currently fixed on the man blocking her path with the specific patience of someone who has chosen, for reasons of strategy rather than weakness, not to respond to stupidity with the fury it deserves. The man blocking her was Pete Garland. I knew him by reputation, small rancher, big mouth, 300 acres of mediocre grazing land that he talked about like it was a kingdom. He was maybe 45, with the kind of weathered face that looks like character until you realize it's just damage. He was grinning. I said, he was saying, loudly enough for the whole room to enjoy it, that we don't want Apache hands touching the wood we burn. You understand that? There's a word for what you are, and it ain't delivery girl. The man beside him, younger, a ranch hand I didn't know, snorted into his beer. The room didn't react exactly. That was the thing that unsettled me. It didn't react, it absorbed. The way a cloth absorbs a spill without comment like it was a natural occurrence. A few men glanced over and looked away. The card game paused, considered, resumed. Old Dunn wiped the bar with the slow, circular motion of a man who had decided that what happened on his premises was not his theology. Sonali did not move, did not shift the wood, did not look away from Garland's face, did not perform anger or fear or anything he might have used. She simply waited, and the waiting itself was a kind of statement that Garland wasn't sophisticated enough to read, which made him angrier. "You deaf too," he said. "No," she said. Her voice was even, not quiet, even. There's a difference. Quiet is about volume, even is about center, about having a place inside yourself that the outside world hasn't gotten to. "I hear you fine. I'm delivering wood to Mr. Dunn. He paid for it 3 days ago. I'll set it down and leave." "You'll leave now," Garland said. "Without setting anything down, that wood goes back with you." "Pete," Dunn said from behind the bar without looking up. "Stay out of it, Dunn. I'm making a point." "You're blocking my delivery," Dunn said, still not looking up. "I'm protecting the health of this establishment. I wrote something in my worry book. I'm not sure what. I do that sometimes when I don't know what else to do with what I'm seeing. Something about the way she held the wood, about the burn scar, about the fact that she had not blinked." Then Pete Garland reached out and pushed the top log off her stack. It hit the floor with a hard crack and rolled, and every single person in that room looked, not at Garland, at her, at what she'd do. She looked down at the log, then up at Garland. Then she crouched, still holding the remaining wood against her chest, picked up the fallen log and reset it on the stack with the focused efficiency of someone completing a task. She straightened. "Move," she said. The room was doing that thing again. That absorption. That collective held breath that wasn't sympathy, wasn't anger, just spectacle. Like 37 men had agreed without speaking that this was entertainment. Garland laughed. The ranch hand beside him laughed. A man at the card table made a sound somewhere between approval and dismissal. And I was writing in my notebook and hating myself for writing and not doing something. And I was about to. I want to believe I was about to stand up when the chair scraped back from the table in the corner by the window, and a man stood up instead. Cole Whitmore was not what I expected. I'd seen him when I arrived. You notice Cole Whitmore the way you notice a particular quality of silence before weather. He was around 32, 33, with the lean, unhurried build of a man who did actual work rather than supervised it. He was dressed well but not showily, clean shirt, good boots, a jacket that fit properly, which was rarer than it sounds out here. He had money, serious money. I'd heard it from 3 separate people in 4 days. Cole Whitmore owned the ridgeback spread north of town, 12,000 acres, the best water rights in the county, a herd that was the envy of every rancher from here to Albuquerque. He was the kind of rich that didn't need to announce itself. He'd been reading something. A book, not a newspaper. I'd noticed because it was the kind of detail that catches a surveyor's eye, something slightly off-grid. He'd been reading quietly in his corner for the better part of an hour, and I'd assumed he was the sort of man who maintained his comfort by not involving himself in other people's problems. I was wrong. He crossed the room in 6 or 7 steps. Not fast, not a dramatic stride, not a rescue charge, just purposeful. He stopped beside Sonali, not between her and Garland, not in front of her, beside her. Like he'd come to stand with her rather than for her. That distinction, I've thought about it 100 times since. He looked at Garland. "Pete," he said. His voice was the most ordinary thing about him. Flat, slightly tired, the way men sound when they've been patient too long. "Cole, this doesn't." "Move," Cole said. "Not move, please. Not I'm asking you to step aside. Just move." The word Sonali had just used, and whether it was intentional I couldn't say for certain, but I wrote it down because it felt like it meant something, like he was confirming that she'd been right to say it, that the word had always been correct, that only Garland's willingness to comply was the variable. Garland stared at him. Here was the thing about Pete Garland. He was a bully, which meant he was also, beneath everything, a calculator. And the calculation in that moment was simple. Cole Whitmore could destroy him without trying, not with violence, with paperwork, with water rights, with the kind of quiet influence that a man of Cole's standing could exercise over a county where everyone owed someone a favor and Cole was the man most people owed. Garland knew this. I could see him knowing it, the exact moment the bluster drained out of his face, and the small, actual man underneath did the math. He stepped aside. He said something, some small, saving thing that I didn't quite catch, meant to sound like it was his own choice. Then he walked back toward the bar, and his ranch hand followed, and the card game resumed, and old Dunn resumed wiping the counter, and the room exhaled. Cole turned to Sonali. She was looking at him with an expression I couldn't parse. Not gratitude, not immediately. Not suspicion exactly. Something more complicated. The look of someone who has been helped enough times in the wrong way to be careful about what shape help takes. "I'll take 2 of those," he said, and nodded at the logs. Then, without making it a performance, he reached over and lifted 2 logs from her stack, tucking them under his arm like it was nothing. She looked at him for another moment. "I can carry them," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm carrying 2, you're carrying 3. That still leaves you working and me watching, which I'm not comfortable with." Something shifted in her face. Not much, barely visible. But I was watching closely. I always watch closely. It's the curse of being a man who measures things, and I caught it. She carried 3 logs to the woodpile. He carried 2. Old Dunn directed them without ceremony. The wood was stacked. It took maybe 4 minutes. Then Sonali picked up the empty sling she'd carried the logs in, folded it efficiently, and turned to leave. Cole said, "Miss." She stopped, didn't turn all the way, half profile. "I'm Cole Whitmore," he said. "I own the ridgeback spread north of town. I need someone who knows this terrain. Knows where the springs are in the high ground, knows the seasonal variations on the eastern slopes. I've been using federal maps that are 8 years old and mostly wrong. I've asked 3 men in this town and gotten 3 different wrong answers." He paused. "I'm told you work as a trail guide." She turned fully then, looked at him with those steady eyes that processed everything without broadcasting the processing. "Who told you that?" "Harlan Bryce at the feed store." A pause, something in her expression that might have been recognition, maybe surprise that he'd asked Harlan, who was one of the few people in Dunmore who spoke about her without cruelty attached. "I charge fair," she said. "I pay fair," he said. Another pause. This one felt like assessment on both sides. "Day after tomorrow," she said. "Dawn, I'll meet you at the North Trail head." Then she left, and I sat in my corner with my worry book open, and 3 different sentences started and crossed out, and I thought, I need to understand what just happened in this room. Not the practical facts of it. The mechanics were clear enough. I needed to understand the thing underneath. The shape of what had just occurred, and why it felt like the beginning of something I was going to have to account for. I ordered another coffee. Dunn set it down without comment. "That woman," I said, because I couldn't help it. "Who is she? What's her situation?" Dunn looked at me for a moment like he was weighing how much I'd earned. "Her father was Hikaria Apache," he said finally. "Her mother was a settler woman from Missouri who came out here in '61 and stayed past the time most settler women had the sense to leave. Sonali grew up knowing both worlds and belonging to neither one cleanly." He set down his rag. "She's been doing trail work and firewood delivery for 3 years since her mother passed. Knows this territory better than the Army. Better than anyone, probably. And people treat her the way Garland just did," I said, not a question. "Every day," he said, not angry about it. Just factual. The way he said it told me the anger had passed through him long ago and settled into something heavier and harder to name. I looked at the door she'd left through. I wrote she carried the wood, she picked up what was knocked down, she stated the word correctly, and then she left. And he carried 2 logs and asked her about springs. I don't know what to call what I'm watching, but I think it's worth watching. The next morning, the morning before the trail day, I was doing survey work in the northern edge of town when I saw her. She was checking her horse. Not in a performative way, not for anyone else's benefit. She was checking its hooves with the focused thoroughness of someone who understood that her survival depended on the horse's reliability. She ran her hand along its left rear leg, frowned slightly, pressed with her thumb at a specific spot above the fetlock, watched the horse's ear for the flicker of sensitivity. I stood at a distance, I was slightly embarrassed to admit, and watched her work. She knew I was there. "You're the surveyor," she said without looking up. "Elias Cord," I said. "I know who you are. Harlan mentioned you too." She set the hoof down, straightened, turned. "You were at Dunn's yesterday." "I was." She looked at me with the same steady assessment she'd directed at Cole. "And you stayed at your table." The words landed with no particular drama attached. Just observation. You stayed at your table. Accurate. Not cruel, just measured. like a surveyor would measure. I felt something in my chest that I decided to call professional courtesy and did not examine further at the time. I was about to get up, I said. She neither confirmed nor denied whether she believed this. He carry wood often, she asked. Whitmore. I don't know him, I said. I'd never seen him before yesterday. She nodded, looked back at the horse, ran her hand along its neck. I grew up watching my mother accept things, she said. She accepted everything. She thought acceptance was the same as peace. She found a small knot in the horse's mane and worked it loose with her fingers. It isn't. Peace is something you build. Acceptance is just exhaustion that learned to stand still. I wrote that down, right there in front of her in my worry book. She glanced at the book. You write everything. Most things, I said. Why? I thought about it honestly. Because I'm afraid of what I'll misremember, and because some things deserve to be recorded. She considered this. Then with no transition whatsoever, she said, the springs on the eastern slope go dry by mid-June and come back in late September. The federal maps show them as permanent. They're not. There's a secondary source half a mile uphill that the maps don't show at all. If Whitmore's running cattle in that range in summer without knowing that, he'll lose animals. She said this simply, not as a gift and not as a demonstration, as information that existed and was relevant and therefore should exist somewhere useful. I'll tell him, I said. I'll tell him myself, she said. Tomorrow. She patted the horse's neck once, final and affectionate. I just wanted to say it out loud first, to see if it felt like enough. She picked up her things and walked away. I stood there for a moment with my notebook open and the sentence she'd said written in it. I wanted to say it out loud first, to see if it felt like enough, and I thought that was maybe the most honest thing I'd heard anyone say in 11 years of living on the road. I closed the book. I went back to measuring land. But I kept thinking about springs that dry up and come back, about maps that are wrong, about the specific courage it takes to carry firewood into a room that doesn't want you in it, and then come back the next day to do it again. That evening, I was walking back through the center of Dunmore when I saw 3 women from the town's church women's circle standing outside the dry goods store. They were watching the door of the small building at the edge of the main street, a leaning structure that served as a kind of informal rooming house for itinerant workers. She stays there, one of the women said to another, in the tone people use when pointing out a wound they feel validated by. It's an embarrassment, said another. Dunn should stop buying her wood, said the third. He's only encouraging it. I stopped. I am not a confrontational man. I measure land for a living. I have a policy against involvement. She delivers on schedule, I heard myself say, and she knows where the springs are. They looked at me. I was already regretting speaking. She's Apache, one of them said, as if this answered everything I'd said and also anything else I might ever say. Yes, I said, she is, and she knows where the springs are, and she picked up the wood garland knocked out of her arms and put it back on the stack without saying a word to him about it, and she's going to save Cole Whitmore's cattle from a federal map that's been wrong for 8 years. I paused. I thought you should know that. Then I walked to my boarding house and sat on the edge of my bed and wrote in my worry book for 20 minutes straight, barely lifting the pen, the way you do when you've been holding something and your hands finally decide to let go. I didn't sleep well. I lay in the dark and thought about maps, about all the things we agree to call permanent that aren't, about all the springs we assume will always be there that quietly vanish by mid-June. And I thought about Sonali's mother, who accepted things until accepting became the whole of her life, and whether accepting things was a survival strategy or a slow surrender, and how you tell the difference from the inside. I thought about a woman standing in a saloon doorway with her arms full of wood, not blinking, not yielding, waiting with the patience of someone who has decided that this particular ground is worth holding. I thought about the burn scar on her forearm, old, healed clean. Fire, not accident. I fell asleep thinking about that. I wasn't supposed to go. That's the truth of it. When Sonali rode north to meet Cole Whitmore at the trailhead at dawn the next day, I was not part of any arrangement. I had survey work to complete, a set of measurements on the southern approach that the railroad needed by the end of the week, and no legitimate reason to be anywhere near the ridgeback spread's upper eastern slopes. I went anyway. I told myself it was professional interest, that the terrain data might be useful, that the springs she'd mentioned were exactly the kind of geographic anomaly my survey should account for. And there was some truth in that. But the real truth, the one I wrote down later because I'd learned by then not to lie to my worry book, was simpler. I wanted to see what happened when those two people were alone in the hills with no audience to perform anything for. I kept a respectful distance, 200 yards at least. Far enough to be honest about not eavesdropping, close enough to see. They met at the trailhead without ceremony. Cole was there first. I'd expected that somehow. The punctuality of a man who respects other people's time. He had 2 horses, a bedroll strapped behind his saddle, and what looked like a rolled map tucked under one arm, which struck me as either preparedness or optimism. He was standing at the horses' heads, not waiting impatiently but not relaxed either, just present. Sunnily arrived at the exact time. No apology in her bearing for not being early. She looked at the second horse. You brought a spare. In case yours threw a shoe. This terrain chews through shoes. She evaluated this for a moment, trying to determine, I think, whether this was consideration or condescension, and apparently concluded it was the former, because she simply nodded and mounted her own horse. They rode. I followed at my distance, making survey notes occasionally so I could honestly say that's what I was doing. The eastern slope of the Ridgeback Range was harder country than the main spread, rocky, scrubbed with pinyon and juniper, the kind of terrain that rewards people who understand it and punishes everyone else with equal indifference. The morning light was at a low angle, hitting the rock faces gold and amber, and I remember thinking it was unreasonably beautiful for a place that had probably killed several unprepared people. For the first hour, they rode mostly in silence. I'd expected conversation, questions and answers, the professional exchange of someone showing another person something they needed to know. There was some of that, but not the way I'd imagined. What I watched instead was something more like a language that doesn't use words as its primary vehicle. She'd pull up at a particular spot and he'd pull up beside her. She'd look at something, a rock formation, a dry stream bed, the pattern of vegetation, and he'd follow her gaze and study it. Sometimes she'd point or gesture. Sometimes she'd say a word or two. Sometimes she just waited until she could tell he'd seen what she'd seen, and then she'd ride on. He asked questions, but not rapid ones. Not the questions of a man filling silence or performing curiosity. Slow questions, spaced out, that told me he'd been thinking about what he'd just seen before he opened his mouth. I liked that about him. I wrote it down. At one point, she rode directly to the edge of a rock shelf and stopped. Below, I could see it from my angle, was a small, brilliant pool of water, tucked in a hollow that the main trail wouldn't reveal. The kind of thing you'd only know was there if someone had shown you, or if you'd been paying a particular quality of attention for a very long time. Cole looked at it for a long moment. "The map doesn't have this," he said. "No," she said. "How long have you known about it?" A pause. "Since I was 8. My mother got lost up here once. We found it by accident." She looked at the water. "She named it, in Apache. Roughly it means the place that hid from everyone else." She said it without sentiment, not without feeling, but with the careful precision of someone who knows the difference between emotion and performance. Cole didn't say anything immediately. The kind of silence that means a person is actually absorbing something rather than waiting for their turn. "Does it have a name on any English record?" he asked. "No. Should it?" She looked at him then, that careful, evaluating look. "That's not a question I expected," she said. "I know." Another pause. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've thought about it. Naming things formally gives them protection. It also changes them." "Both at once," he said. "Yes, both at once." They stayed at the pool for maybe 15 minutes. She told him about the water's consistency, that it ran cold even in August, that it fed from a deep rock seam rather than a seasonal snowmelt, that it was reliable in ways the larger, more visible springs weren't. He listened in a way that was almost physical, leaning slightly forward, occasionally writing something in a small notebook of his own. I noticed something as I watched. He was writing in a notebook, she was speaking from memory, and the knowledge that flowed between them was entirely hers. But the dynamic between them didn't feel like transaction. It felt, at a distance of 200 yards in the early morning light, like two people carefully exploring whether they might trust each other. Around midday, they stopped at a flat rock in a sheltered draw to eat. I pulled up farther back and ate my own provisions, watching from shade. They'd been talking more freely by then. Something had loosened in the hours of riding together, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but I could see it in the spacing of their horses when they stopped, the way the silence between exchanges had shifted from professional distance to something more comfortable. The silences of people who don't feel the need to constantly fill the air between them. I caught pieces of the conversation when the breeze cooperated. 3 years since you started doing this on your own, he said. 2.5, she corrected. My mother died in April of '85. I started in June. Was it? He stopped, reconsidered the question, apparently, started again. Why guiding? You knew the terrain, but that's not the same as choosing it as work. A pause, wind moved through the juniper. Because it was the one thing I knew that other people needed and couldn't fake, she said. A man can fake strength. He can fake authority. He can fake belonging in a town. She looked at the range above them. You cannot fake knowing where the water is. Either you know or you don't, and if you don't, people die. He was quiet for a moment. And people still treated you the way Garland did, he said. People treat me that way regardless of what I know or what I provide, she said. The flatness of it, the complete absence of surprise in the sentence, was more devastating than any bitterness would have been. She wasn't complaining. She was reporting. She was being precise about conditions, the way you're precise about terrain. That's not going to keep happening, Cole said. Not while I'm around. She looked at him, and this time the look was different, not assessing, not guarded. Something more raw, dangerous in the way that hope is always dangerous when you've built your life carefully without it. You can't promise that, she said. I know I can't promise it for the whole territory, he said. I can promise it for every room I'm in. She held his gaze for a moment. That's a strange thing to promise a woman you hired 2 days ago, she said. It is, he agreed. I wrote, I am watching 2 people negotiate the distance between what they've been told they're allowed and what they might actually want. It is the most delicate thing I have ever observed at 200 yards. The afternoon deepened. They worked into the higher terrain, the area Cole was most concerned about, the eastern grazing slopes where his summer herds would push against the limits of the water sources the federal map showed. Sonali walked him through it methodically, where the main springs went seasonal, where the secondary ones held longer, what the indicator vegetation told you about subsurface water, how to read the rock discoloration that meant seepage even when the surface was dry. She was extraordinary at this, I mean that technically. The precision of her knowledge, not just what she knew, but how she communicated it, the layered quality of the information, the way she'd answer the question you hadn't thought to ask yet, was the work of someone who had spent years turning pain into expertise. Every piece of knowledge she carried was something she'd earned in a world that gave her nothing for free. Cole kept up. More than that, he was a good listener, which is rarer than people think, and he had a rancher's practical intelligence that processed information in terms of consequence. Not just where is the water, but what does this mean for the herd in September? What does this mean for the routes I need to maintain? What does this mean for the decisions I make in March before the season turns? At one point he said, I've been running this spread for 6 years, and nobody has told me half of what you've shown me today. Nobody you asked knew it, she said. I should have asked you sooner. She looked at him sidelong as they rode. You didn't know I existed. I should have found out you existed sooner, he amended. She almost smiled. It was the first time I'd seen anything like it, not a full smile, but the shape of one beginning, the way a spring starts before it breaks surface. I wrote it down immediately because I was afraid I'd mistake it for a trick of the light. The trouble started around 3 in the afternoon. They were, I was at my distance, coming back through the lower draw when the 3 riders appeared on the ridge above. Garland, the ranch hand from the saloon, and a 3rd man I didn't recognize. They came down at a pace that was deliberately unhurried, the pace of men who want you to know they're not afraid, which usually means they've done the math and decided the numbers favor them. I pulled up in my shade and felt my hand go to a notebook instead of anything useful. Old habit. Whitmore, Garland said, reining in his horse. His eyes moved to Sonali with a contempt that he didn't bother to temper. Heard you were up in the hills today, with company. Heard correctly, Cole said. His voice hadn't changed. The same flat, slightly tired quality. People are talking. People in Dunmore talk about everything. It's the primary industry. Garland's jaw tightened. You know what kind of talking I mean. I do, Cole said, and I find I don't care about it. Garland looked at Sonali again. You're making a mistake, Cole, associating your name with the person who knows where every spring in this county is, Cole said. With the person who just spent 6 hours walking me through terrain I've been managing blind for 6 years. That kind of association, he paused. I hope so. It's the best business decision I've made this quarter. It wasn't what Garland had expected. He'd expected defensiveness, or apology, or the subtle retreat that men with wealth sometimes perform to avoid social friction. What he got instead was accounting. Cole had framed the whole thing as a business matter, which in a territory where money was the closest thing to law was its own kind of argument. Sonali, through all of this, had not moved, had not looked at Garland. She was looking at a point on the ridge above, with the particular quality of attention that means a person is not actually looking at anything, but is using the appearance of looking to hold herself together. I saw her hand, the one closest to me, grip the saddle horn once, quick, tight, then release. This isn't over, Garland said, to Cole or to her or to both. It wasn't clear. No, Cole said, but this part of it is. We have water data to review. Garland left. They always leave when the math doesn't work. They leave and they recalculate and they come back in different configurations. And that's the part that's never over, the part where you know it wasn't the last time. Sonali watched until the riders were gone over the ridge. Then she said very quietly, You didn't have to do that. Which part? Any of it, all of it. A pause. You could have let him say what he was going to say, and we could have ridden back and finished the arrangement professionally, and then what? Cole said. You go back to delivering firewood to the people who make your life hard, and I go back to managing land I don't fully understand, because asking certain questions apparently has a social cost I was never asked to pay. Sonali looked at him. I'm not performing anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not doing this because it makes me look a certain way or because I've decided to have an opinion about how Apache women should be treated. I'm doing it because you're right and he's wrong, and I own 12,000 acres and decent water rights, and I can afford to say so. She was quiet for a long moment. That's one of the most practical-sounding things anyone has ever said in my defense, she said. Is that bad? Another pause, and then fully this time unmistakably she smiled. It was a short thing, a guarded thing, the smile of a woman who has learned to keep her best things protected. But it was real, and it changed her face in the way that real things do, and Cole saw it and something in his own expression shifted in response. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way ground shifts when water finally finds it. No, she said, it's not bad. They rode back toward town. I rode behind them at my 200 yards, writing without looking at my notebook, watching the way the late afternoon light hit the country they'd just mapped together. That evening, I was at Dunn's again. Cole came in around 8. He sat at his usual corner table. His book was there, but he didn't open it. He ordered coffee and sat with it and looked at nothing in particular, which is the look of a man whose thoughts are somewhere more interesting than the room he's in. I went over. I don't normally do this, insert myself into situations I've been observing at a distance. But I'd been carrying the day around for hours, and I needed to say something to someone. She knows every spring in this county, I said, sitting down. He looked at me, unsurprised. I think he'd noticed me at some point during the day and decided not to mention it. She does, he said. And the map she carries in her head is better than anything the Federal Survey has produced. By a significant margin. I put my worry book on the table. I've been a land surveyor for 11 years. I am considered somewhat expert at understanding terrain. And I'll tell you honestly, what I watched today was the best applied geographic knowledge I've seen in my career. Cole looked at the book, then at me. I know, he said. She should be compensated accordingly, I said. Not trail guide wages, consulting wages, survey-level wages. Something in his face that might have been agreement already in motion. I was planning on having that conversation tomorrow. Good, I picked up my book, started to get up, then sat back down because there was one more thing. She had a burn scar, old one, left forearm. His expression didn't change exactly, but it deepened. I noticed it, he said. Fire, not accident, I said, old enough that she was young when it happened. A pause. Dunmore, I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she told me this afternoon she was 12, her family's structure, they had a place a few miles out. Some men from a neighboring settlement decided the land was worth more without Apache on it. He looked at the table. Her mother pulled her out. The scar is from the door frame. She went back in for something, I don't know what, and her mother came back in after her, and that's how Sonali got out. I sat with that for a moment. And she still delivers wood to this town, I said. Every week, he said, on schedule. I opened my worry book. I wrote, persistence is not always the same as forgiveness. Sometimes it's just the refusal to let other people's ugliness determine the shape of your life. I closed it. She's coming by the spread day after tomorrow, Cole said, to walk me through the eastern boundary markers. Compensation will be discussed. Good, I said. I went back to my table, and I sat there for a long time, drinking lukewarm coffee, writing nothing, just thinking about what it takes to carry firewood into a room that doesn't want you, pick up what gets knocked down and come back anyway. Come back. Every week. It was a Saturday. 12 days after the trail day. 12 days during which I'd managed to extend my surveying contract twice. Once legitimately, once by noting in my report to the railroad that there were geographic anomalies in the eastern range that required additional verification, which was technically true and also a reason I'd manufactured to stay. I'm not proud of the manufacturing, I am proud of the staying. The Ridgeback Commission had moved forward. Sonali had walked Cole's eastern boundary twice more, documented the spring locations with a precision that I, as a professional surveyor, found genuinely impressive, and had begun to receive, per what I heard from Dunn, a consulting arrangement that compensated her at a rate that was remarkable for the territory and the time. Cole had put it in writing. She told him she didn't need it in writing. He said, I know you don't need it. I want it in writing because it's right. She'd taken the paper. In those 12 days, something else had been happening too. Something quieter, less formal, harder to document. The kind of thing that doesn't appear in ledgers or survey reports, but that a man with a worry book can't help recording anyway. They'd started talking. Not about springs and boundary markers, or not only about those things. Cole had gotten in the habit of being at Dunn's in the evenings, and Sonali had gotten in the habit of stopping there after her deliveries, and somewhere in the overlap of those two habits, a conversation had started that seemed to require many evenings to complete. I witnessed most of it from my corner table with my cold coffee and my notebook, which I'm sure was inappropriate and which I am unable to regret. What I watched was two people who had both, in different ways, been formed by loss. Cole had told me once, in one of the brief exchanges we'd developed, that his parents had died when he was 19, and he'd built the Ridgeback with an inheritance of 100 acres, and a stubbornness he described as probably genetic, learning whether it was possible to trust someone who had every reason not to trust anyone. Not in a smooth way, not in a story way. In a real way, which meant backtracking and misunderstandings and evenings that ended with more distance than they'd started with, and then the next evening starting again from wherever they'd honestly landed. I watched Sonali laugh for the first time about 9 days in. A real laugh, surprised out of her by something Cole said, unexpected enough that she seemed slightly startled by her own reaction. And then Cole looked at her with an expression I can only describe as the look of a man who has just discovered something he hadn't known he'd been looking for. I wrote it down immediately. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the thing that happened on Saturday, the thing this account is actually about, I haven't told you yet. And I need to tell it correctly. Saturday was a market day in Dunmore. The main street filled up with buyers and sellers from the surrounding ranches and settlements, wagons and horses and children and commerce, the kind of organized chaos that makes small towns feel briefly like real cities. Sonali had a wood delivery that morning. She came through on her small cart, efficient as always, managing the horse through the crowd with the easy authority of someone for whom this was routine. She made 2 stops, collected payment, stacked wood, exchanged minimal pleasantries with done. And then, as she was loading the empty slings back into the cart, Garland appeared. He'd brought company this time. Not just the ranch hand, 5 or 6 men, a loose cluster that positioned itself around the cart with the careful casualness of people who have decided on a course of action and want it to look spontaneous. I was on the boardwalk outside the land office, maybe 30 yards away. I saw it developing the way you see weather developing when you know the land, the shape of it, the intent before it's arrived. "You've been spending a lot of time at the Ridgeback," Garland said. His voice was pitched to carry. It was a Saturday, the street was full, and he wanted an audience. He got one. Sonali loaded the last sling without looking at him. "I've been doing contracted survey work for Mr. Whitmore." "Survey work," Garland said, with the specific intonation of a man putting quotation marks around words he means to contaminate. A few people on the nearby boardwalk chuckled. "Apache women doing survey work. Now I've heard everything." She turned, not defensively, just to face him directly, the way she always faced things directly. "You've heard it because it's true," she said. "I've heard it because Cole Whitmore's lost his sense," Garland said, louder. "And the people of this town have a right to know that the man who holds the water rights for most of this county has apparently decided to compensate skilled work with fair wages," said a voice from across the street. Cole. He'd been at the feed store. He was crossing the street now, not hurrying, and the crowd on the boardwalk parted the way crowds part for men with his particular combination of wealth and composure. He came to stand beside Sonali's cart, not between her and Garland, beside her. Again. That detail again, which I had come to understand, was not accidental. "I was explaining to these folks," Garland said, "that there's a question about your judgment." "There's a question about your facts," Cole said. "She's done 3 formal survey assessments of the Ridgeback Eastern Range in the last 2 weeks. I've filed copies with the county land office. Her documentation is better than anything produced by the federal survey." He looked at the crowd that had gathered, not performing it, just including them in the accuracy. "She also identified a secondary spring that increases my reliable water access by about 30% and will directly affect my herd capacity this summer. The county benefits from that. So before we have a conversation about my judgment, let's have one about the results." Garland's face had gone through several colors. "That's not what people are talking about," he said, lower now, more direct. "And you know it." "I know what people are talking about," Cole said. "I've heard all of it, every version." A pause. The street had gone that particular quiet. "And," Garland said. Cole looked at Sonali. She was looking at him with the careful hope expression, the one she guarded, the one that made her slightly vulnerable in a way she usually didn't permit. And something in her face said she didn't know what was coming, which meant I didn't know what was coming, which meant nobody in that street knew what was coming. Cole said, "I'm asking her to marry me." Complete silence. The kind of silence that a room or a street produces when something happens that it doesn't have any pre-existing response for. "That's what I'm doing," he continued, and his voice was still that flat, tired quality, but underneath it now was something else, something that took effort, that was costing him something that he was paying anyway. "So the conversation about my judgment can include that fact." He turned from Garland and fully faced Sonali. "And this is the part I need to record as precisely as I can, because this is the part that mattered." He didn't go down on a knee, he didn't produce a ring, he didn't perform it, he just looked at her. The way you look at someone when you've made a decision that you know is right, and you're uncertain whether it's welcome, and you're willing to be uncertain and to ask anyway. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this for a week," he said, more quietly now, not for the crowd, for her. "I don't think there is a right way, there's just asking, so I'm asking." Sonali looked at him for a long moment. Her face was doing something complicated. I've spent a lot of time on this sentence in my worry book, trying to get it right. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't joy or shock or the beautiful helplessness of a romance in a novel. It was recognition. The expression of a person who has been trying to decide whether something they've been suspecting for a while is real or a story they're telling themselves, and who has just received the answer. "You're asking me this," she said, "in the middle of the street on a market day." "I am. With Pete Garland as a witness. Apparently." The corner of her mouth moved. "That's the strangest courtship I've heard of." "I know," he said. "I've been told my judgment is questionable." And she laughed. It was the same surprised laugh I'd seen 9 days ago, the one that startled her slightly. But this time it didn't close again. This time it stayed open. The crowd was still utterly silent. "Yes," she said. "Just that, yes. What happened afterward was not a fairy tale. I want to be careful about that, careful to record what was real rather than what the occasion seemed to call for." Garland left. He turned his horse and rode out with his men without another word, which was its own kind of statement, not defeat exactly, but the end of a particular chapter of a particular effort. He would be back in some form. That part was never over. The crowd dispersed with the slow, self-conscious movement of people who have witnessed something they need time to process before they have opinions about it. Old Dunn, watching from his doorway, went back inside. Cole and Sonali stood at her cart in the clearing street. I stayed on my boardwalk and wrote everything I could remember before it faded. They talked for a while quietly, too quietly for me to catch any of it from 30 yards, and I had the sense and the decency not to move closer. But I watched their faces, watched the way the conversation moved between serious and less serious, the way it clearly covered practical things, where, when the arrangements that a decision like this requires, alongside whatever personal things they were saying to each other that were not for any ledger. At one point, Sonali looked up and saw me on the boardwalk. I raised my notebook briefly, the best I could do. She inclined her head, the best she could do from 30 yards. I found Cole at Dunn's that afternoon, alone at his corner table. He had his book open but wasn't reading it. I sat down across from him without asking, which was by then our established pattern. "You're a braver man than I am," I said. He looked at me, tired and something else, something that looked like a man who has committed to a course and is now processing the full weight of what he's committed to, not with regret, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement that it was not a small thing. "I'm a man who is very tired of measuring what things are worth in the currency other people set," he said. I looked at him for a moment. "She said yes," I offered. "She said yes. To the question, to the rest of it." "I know the rest of it won't be simple," he said. "I know this town and I know the territory and I know what's coming." He looked at his book. "I also know what she carries in her head, what she knows, what she's built out of what's been done to her." A pause. "I know what kind of person picks up the log that someone knocked out of her arms and puts it back on the stack without saying a word." I wrote that down right there. I just wrote it down. "What kind?" I said, even though I knew. "The kind," he said, "that has decided her own standards are the ones that matter, and I want to be around that. I want to learn from that." I closed my book. "The springs," I said, "the ones she showed you, the ones the map didn't have." "Yes." She told me something about them, on the morning before the trail day when I ran into her checking her horse. She said she found the main one when she was 8. Her mother got lost up there. "They found it by accident." He nodded slowly. "She named it," I said, "in Apache, roughly the place that hid from everyone else." The word settled. "I want to know its name," he said quietly. "The real one, the one she's carried since she was 8 years old." "Ask her," I said. "I will," he said. I left Dunmore 6 days later. My survey contract was genuinely complete. No more extensions could be manufactured without becoming dishonest, and I had at least one value still intact. I finished my final measurements on the southern approach, wrote up my report, packed my 3 notebooks. On my last morning, I walked to the small building at the edge of the main street where Sonali kept her things, and I knocked. She answered. She looked at me with no particular surprise. "You're leaving," she said. "Today," I said. "I wanted to. I've been watching all of this. I want you to know that I wrote it down, the real version." She looked at the notebook I was holding. "Why?" she said. "Because it's worth recording," I said. "Because what you did, what you keep doing, coming back, carrying what gets knocked out of your hands, knowing where the water is, it deserves to exist somewhere outside of just this town." She was quiet for a moment. "He asked me about the name," she said. "The Apache name for the spring." A pause. I told him. "Good," I said. "He repeated it back to me correctly on the 3rd try," she said. and the corner of her mouth moved the way it does when she's not going to smile but wants to acknowledge that something is good. He practiced. I thought about a man with 12,000 acres and serious water rights sitting somewhere, practicing an Apache word until he could say it correctly, because it was the right name for a thing, and he wanted to use the right name for it. I wrote it in my worry book right there on the doorstep, because it seemed like the kind of detail that the story needed, and that I was in danger of carrying only in my head. She watched me write. "Will anyone read that?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "Probably just me, and after me, no one." I closed it. But the writing is how I remember correctly. The writing is how I make sure I don't convince myself that what I saw was something other than what it was. She nodded, accepting this. I started to leave, then turned back because there was one more thing. There was always one more thing with her. "The burn scar," I said. "Your mother pulled you out of the fire." She looked at me steadily. "She went back in after you," I said. "What was it? What did you go back in for?" A pause, a long one. "A book," she said. "My mother's. It had her mother's handwriting in the margins, my grandmother's, her notes. She'd come to the territory from Missouri and she'd written everything she saw in the margins of this book, everything she was trying to understand." Sonali looked at her hand, not the scarred arm, the other one. "I thought if I lost it, we'd lose her voice, the one who had already tried to bridge all of this before us." I stood there. "Did you save it?" "Yes," she said. "And the scar?" "And the scar," she said, both at once. She looked at me with those steady, dark eyes that processed everything and broadcast only what they chose to broadcast. "That's what you write in that book of yours," she said. "Not the fire, not the scar, write what was saved." I nodded. I walked to my horse. I rode south out of Dunmore in the early morning, the light hitting the eastern slopes gold and amber, and I thought about everything that hid from everyone else until the right person came along who knew how to look. I thought about women who carry the right name for things in a world that insists on the wrong ones. I thought about men who practice words until they can say them correctly. I thought about my grandmother's handwriting in the margins of a book that a 12-year-old girl walked back into fire to preserve. I didn't write anything for the first hour, I just rode. Then I opened the worry book, balanced it on the saddle horn the way I'd learned over 11 years, and I wrote. She said yes, and he practices the name. And somewhere north of Dunmore there is a spring that the maps don't show, and it has a name, and the name is right, and both of those things are true at the same time, and that is going to have to be enough of a miracle for today.